March 1945. Aachen. The air was thick with pulverized cement, a choking gray powder that tasted of iron. Helga knelt, shielding her youngest son, Lothar, with her body. The screaming was constant, a high, thin sound from somewhere beneath the fractured lath and plaster to her left. "Carl!" she screamed, her voice ripping. "Carl!" A shadow fell over her, a tall man in a strange olive-drab uniform. Amerikaner. The propaganda posters flashed in her mind. A grinning ape dragging a German woman. She froze, clutching Lothar so tightly he whimpered. The soldier's rifle was slung, but his eyes were fixed on the pile she was clawing at. He held up a hand, palm out. "Easy, a mutter. Easy." He crouched, his gaze analytical and pointed. "In there? Kind?" She could only nod, tears cutting clean paths through the grime on her face. He turned and yelled something she did not understand, a sharp, guttural command. Another soldier appeared. The corporal pointed again. "In there. Get digging. Now." If this moment in history resonates, consider subscribing for more untold stories. We are interested to hear what country you are watching from. 3 days earlier, the Keller. The world had shrunk to the smell of damp earth, sour wine, and mildew. For 10 days, the Keller, a vaulted brick cavern beneath the ruins of their apartment building, had been their universe. Helga pulled the thin wool blanket tighter around Lothar. The boy, 4 years old, shivered in his sleep, his breath a small, pale cloud in the lantern light. Her older son, Carl, 7, sat awake, his back pressed against a damp cask. He was coughing again, a dry rasping sound that echoed too loudly in the crowded silence. "Hush, Carl," Helga whispered, her own throat raw. "Drink." She offered him the tin cup. The water inside was cloudy and tasted of rust, but it was all they had. In the far corner, the Volksempfänger, their people's radio, sat dark and silent. Its batteries had died 3 days ago, but its last broadcasts still haunted the air. It had spat warnings of the Amerikaner, monsters, barbarians fueled by Jewish hatred, who would steal children and defile women. The official party newspaper, read aloud by Herr Hess until the bombs drove them underground, had promised a terrible vengeance if the Amis ever set foot in Aachen. Now they were here. The floor vibrated constantly. It was not the sharp crack of artillery anymore, but a deeper, grinding rumble that shook the dust from the ceiling beams in steady streams. "They are close," murmured Frau Schmidt, her neighbor. Her rosary beads clicked rhythmically in the gloom. "The Bolsheviks were worse," they said. "But these are godless." Helga clutched the small, hard object in her coat pocket. It was a porcelain bird, tiny, with one wing chipped. It was Carl's, a silly carnival prize from a life that felt centuries, not years ago. She gripped it as if it were a talisman against the noise. "We should have hung the white sheets," a man's voice rasped from the darkness, like the leaflet said. "That is defeatism," Herr Hess snapped. His voice, once booming in the courtyard, was now a strained, terrified hiss. Cowardice, the Führer's final victory. His words were cut off by a deafening roar. It was not a bomb. It was something heavier, something metallic, grinding to a halt directly over their heads. The vibration was so intense it rattled Helga's teeth. A tank. Silence. The collective breath of 20 people was held. Helga could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. Carl's eyes were wide, fixed on the ceiling. Then a new sound, a sharp, cracking explosion from just down the street, followed by shouting. It was not German. It was English, a hard, barking language she only knew from the propaganda films. Another explosion, this one much, much closer. The ground heaved. The lantern flickered, sputtered, and died, plunging the cellar into absolute blackness. The only light came in a sudden, violent flash as the wall at the far end of the cellar, the one leading to the street, imploded, showering the room in brick and frozen soil. Lothar woke with a scream. Helga threw herself over him, tasting cement. "Carl," she yelled into the chaos. "Carl, where are you?" She heard only the moans of the injured and the terrifying, steady sound of digging from above. The dust from the first blast settled slowly, coating every surface in a fine, gritty powder. Lothar's screams had subsided into a weak, rasping cry that tore at Helga's nerves more than the artillery. "Wasser," he whimpered. "Mama, water." Helga fumbled in the dark for the tin cup. Her fingers found it on its side, empty. The explosion had overturned their meager ration. Carl, quiet as stone, was staring at the hole where the outer wall had been, a ragged gap breathing sulfur and cold air. "I will get more," Helga said, her voice sounding too loud. She knew there was a hand pump in the attached laundry room, perhaps 10 meters away, through an inner door that was likely blocked. As she rose to her feet, a shadow moved. "Where are you going, Frau?" It was Herr Hess. He had been the apartment block's blockwart, the local warden, an officious man nobody liked but everyone feared. Even in the cellar, he clung to his phantom authority. "My son is thirsty," Helga stated, pulling her shawl tighter, "the pump in the laundry." "That is desertion," Hess hissed, stepping to block the damaged doorway. "Leaving the shelter is forbidden. The leaflets are lies. The Amerikaner shoots civilians on sight. It is a trick to draw you out. He is 4. He needs water, not politics. Politics is what keeps us alive." Hess's voice cracked with a fanatic's terror. He fumbled in his coat, withdrawing a crumpled, browned newspaper. He held it up, angling it toward the weak beam of another man's flashlight. "You think this is a game? You doubt the Reich?" He began to read, his voice gaining its old, declarative strength. "Listen, from the Völkischer Beobachter. They call it the Morgenthau Plan," he recited, "a Jewish plot. They will not just defeat us. They will erase us. They will flood our minds, dismantle our factories, and sterilize our men. Our nation will be a field of potatoes." A murmur of genuine fear spread through the darkness. Frau Schmidt's rosary beads stopped clicking. This was not the radio. This was a man they knew, reading words that confirmed their deepest dread. "They are not soldiers," Hess concluded, his eyes scanning the shadowed faces. "They are devils, and you would walk out to meet them." Helga faltered. The propaganda was a thick, choking fog. What if he was right? What if she was walking toward a fate worse than the bombs? Before she could answer, the splintered remains of the outer cellar door were kicked open. A figure stumbled in, silhouetted against the gray, smoking daylight. He was not American. He wore the black uniform of the SS, though it was torn and dark with blood. He looked impossibly young, perhaps 18, his face plaster white. He clutched his stomach with one hand and held his rifle with the other. He surveyed the huddle of civilians, the old men, the weeping women, the children, with utter contempt. "What is this?" he spat, leaning heavily against a wine cask. "A nest of rats?" Frau Schmidt, brave in her piety, whispered, "We must, perhaps a white flag. The children." The SS boy laughed, a wet, horrifying sound that ended in a cough. "A flag? Surrender?" He slid down the cask, leaving a dark smear. "You disgust me. I would rather die. I will die. Before I let those Untermenschen soil this city." He tried to raise his rifle toward the civilians, but his strength failed him. His helmet, heavy and awkward, rolled from his head and clanged onto the brick floor. Helga stared at him. He was dying for the words Herr Hess had just read. He was dying for the radio broadcasts, for the Führer, for an idea. And in that moment she realized a cold, terrible truth. This blind, suicidal pride, This fanaticism that demanded the sacrifice of children, this was the immediate enemy. This was the thing that would kill them all, long before any American soldier had the chance. Herr Hess had stopped reading. The newspaper, its warnings of a terrible future, slipped from his fingers. The SS boy gasped, shuddered, and was still. The only sound in the cellar was the smell of cordite and the scraping of brick from the street above. The silence left by the dead SS soldier was heavier, somehow, than the noise of the battle. It was a vacuum, thick with the smell of blood, fear, and the metallic tang of cordite. Herr Hess had slumped against the wall, the forgotten newspaper still clutched in his hand. No one spoke. No one looked at the body. Helga held Lothar, rocking him, her ears straining against the quiet. Then it began. It was not the familiar whistling scream of artillery, nor the crump of mortars. It was a vibration, low and seismic, felt first in the soles of her feet and the base of her spine. A deep mechanical growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. It grew steadily, not just in volume, but in physical presence, shaking the loose dirt from the vaulted ceiling. Carl, who had been preternaturally still, scrambled over to Helga, burying his face in her coat. He knew that sound. They all did, but this was different. The rhythmic clatter of a panzer was a sound of home, of power. This was coarser, a grinding, relentless chewing of the street above. The rumbling became a roar. It was moving, passing the ruin. Gott, Frau Schmidt whispered, her prayers frantic. Gott, steh uns bei. God, help us. The sound intensified, drowning out the woman's words. It was no longer passing. It was turning. Helga could hear the agonizing squeal of metal as one tread locked, pivoting the immense weight. It was coming toward them. The roar was directly overhead. The brick arches groaned. Small pebbles and clouds of plaster dust rained down. Helga shielded both boys with her body, convinced this was the end, that the ceiling would collapse and bury them all in a shared, anonymous grave. The noise was physical, a weight pressing on her chest, vibrating her bones, and then as suddenly as it began, the engine idled, a heavy, throbbing pant, and cut out. The silence that rushed in was absolute. It was more terrifying than the noise. The sheer weight of the machine above them, now still, felt like a tomb lid. Helga held her breath. The propaganda, the SS boys' fanaticism, Herr Hess's newspaper, it all dissolved. The abstract Amerikaner was no longer an idea, a boogeyman from the radio. It was a multi-ton steel monster sitting 10 feet above her children. They were here. They were real. A sharp, metallic clank echoed from above. A hatch? A smell, sharp and chemical, new to the cellar's palette of damp earth and decay, snaked through the opening. Diesel fumes. Voices. They were not shouting. They were speaking, their tones conversational, almost casual. The sound was muffled by the debris, but the language was unmistakable. Hard consonants, flat vowels, English. Hell of a mess, one voice said. Check the cellars? Think anyone's... Another replied. A third voice cut in, sharper, giving a command she could not parse. Helga's entire body went cold. They were not just on the street. They were dismounting. They were organized. They were searching. A heavy boot scraped against stone, dislodging a small cascade of rubble near the hole in the wall. The footsteps were heavy, confident, crunching over the ruined landscape of her home. They were moving toward the cellar entrance. The footsteps above stopped. Helga waited, her entire body rigid, listening to the muffled scrape of metal and the low, guttural English voices. They were organizing. They were clearing the street, building by building, and this cellar was next. The body of the SS soldier, a grim testament to fanaticism, lay near the main entrance, a potential death sentence for them all if the Americans thought they were harboring troops. She looked away from the body, toward the inner wall. It was an archway leading deeper into the cellar, toward the old laundry room. It seemed thicker, safer, further from the street. "Carl," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Lothar, we move, now, to the back." She gathered Lothar, who had fallen into an exhausted, whimpering sleep, and tried to pull Carl to his feet. Carl did not move. He was staring, mesmerized, at the dead soldier. His 7-year-old mind, raised on parades and heroic posters, was trying to reconcile the image of a savior with the pale, slack-jawed boy slumped against the cask. "Carl, calm," she hissed, yanking his arm. It was this hesitation, this single, frozen second of a child's morbid curiosity that sealed their fate. A new sound came, not from the street entrance, but from the very wall she was moving toward. It was not a rumble, it was a sharp, splitting crack, like a giant setting a chisel to stone. Helga had time for one thought. "They are coming through the walls." She never finished the thought. The explosion was not a sound, it was a physical blow. It was the fist of God slamming into the foundation, a localized, deafening concussion that felt entirely different from the artillery. The world inverted. Helga was thrown violently backward, her body skidding across the dirt floor. She landed hard against a row of wine racks, the impact driving the air from her lungs. Miraculously, her arms had remained locked around Lothar, shielding him from the worst of the impact. The air vanished, replaced by a scalding, impenetrable cloud of pulverized brick, plaster, and ancient sour dust. It was not darkness. It was burial. It was thick, choking, and absolute. She gagged, pulling the hem of her woolen coat over Lothar's face, trying to create a pocket of air. Screams echoed in the blackness, thin, terrified shrieks from Herr Hess and Frau Schmidt. Helga realized dimly that she was screaming too. She coughed, her lungs on fire. "Carl?" Her voice was dead, absorbed instantly by the thick, particulate fog. "Carl!" Panic, colder and sharper than the cellar air, cut through the shock. She pushed Lothar into the arms of a moaning Frau Schmidt and crawled forward on her hands and knees. "Carl, answer me!" Her outstretched hand met nothing, just empty, swirling, acrid air. Slowly, agonizingly, the worst of the dust began to settle. A faint gray light, filtering from the first hole in the cellar, the one from the tank, struggled to penetrate the gloom. It illuminated a nightmare. The inner archway, the safe place she had been moving toward, was gone. The wall had collapsed inward, creating a mountain of fractured brick, splintered support beams, and shattered casks. Carl had been standing directly in its path. No. The word was a dry sob, a denial. No, no, nicht, nicht! She scrambled to the edge of the pile, clawing at the debris. The bricks were heavy, interlocked. Her fingers, scraped raw, met only solid, unforgiving rubble. He was gone. Her son was gone. Buried. The propaganda, the SS boy, the hunger, it all evaporated, replaced by a singular, hollow agony. She felt her pocket. The small, hard shape of the porcelain bird was still there. She pulled it out, staring at it stupidly. The chipped wing. Carl's favorite. "Carl!" she screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure loss. She listened, expecting only the terrible silence of the grave, and from deep within the rubble, so faint it was almost imaginary, she heard it. A thin, terrified, muffled cry. He was alive. "He's alive!" Helga screamed, not to anyone, but to the universe. "Carl, I am coming!" She attacked the pile of rubble, her hands transformed into claws. She ripped at splintered wood and heaved chunks of plaster. The bricks were heavy, wedged tight, and her fingers were already bleeding, but she felt nothing. Not the cold, not the pain. There was only the sound of her son's crying, fainter now, a terrified whimper, and the hammering of her own blood. Lothar, sensing the shift in terror, began to wail from behind her where Frau Schmidt was trying to comfort him. "Be silent!" Helga shrieked at him, a command of pure animal panic. "Mama is here, Carl. Hold on." She was so consumed, so focused on the single task of moving a mountain that she did not hear the second, heavier set of footsteps. The main cellar door, the one leading to the street, was kicked open with such violence that it tore from its remaining hinge and crashed onto the stone floor. Dust, thicker and colder, billowed in. Silhouetted against the sickly gray daylight were two men. They were not boys, like the SS soldier. They were large, broad-shouldered, and draped in equipment, canvas bags, grenades, and canteens. They wore the strange, deep helmets she had only seen in newsreels, Amerikaner. "Jesus H. Christ," one of them breathed, taking in the scene, the dead SS soldier, the rubble, the cowering civilians. Then the professionalism took over. "Raus!" the taller one bellowed, his voice a shocking explosion of sound. He brought his rifle up. "Handy hoch! Get up! Schnell!" Bright, blinding beams from flashlights attached to their helmets sliced through the gloom, pinning each survivor like a trapped animal. The light found Herr Hess, his hands shooting up so fast he nearly fell over. It found Frau Schmidt, who was trying to raise her hands while holding the crying Lothar. Then the beam found Helga. She was frozen, half-turned, her hands still resting on the pile of bricks. "You!" the soldier shouted. "Hands up, now!" A choice, instantaneous and impossible, tore through her. To obey was to stop digging. To stop digging was to let Carl die. She heard the metallic click-clack of a rifle bolt being pulled back, a sound that promised finality. "Mama!" Carl's voice, small and suffocating. It broke the spell. Helga turned her back on the soldier. She turned her back on the rifle, on the commands, on the invader who held her life in his hands. She fell to her knees, shielding the section of the pile where the sound had come from, and began to dig again with a guttural sob. "No," she whispered, her voice choked with dirt and defiance. "Kubantoiji, shoot me! I am not leaving my son." The cellar fell silent. The only sounds were Helga's frantic scraping and Lothar's terrified sobs. "What the hell is she doing?" The second soldier, a corporal, muttered in English. "Is she digging?" "Get her up," the first soldier ordered, his voice cold. "She's hiding something, or she's crazy. Get her up now." Helga felt the presence behind her, a heavy tread crunching on the debris. A shadow fell over her. She braced for the impact. A boot, a rifle butt, the searing finality of a bullet. She clutched the porcelain bird in her pocket, its chipped wing digging into her palm, and continued to claw at a stubborn piece of timber. A large gloved hand seized her shoulder. The grip on her shoulder was not a blow. It was steel, a vice-like pressure that stopped her movement completely. Helga fought against it, a wild, guttural sound ripping from her throat. She thrashed, trying to twist free, to get back to the bricks. "Let me go," she shrieked in German. "He is in there, my boy." The soldier, a corporal, simply held her. He did not hit her. He did not shoot. He absorbed her frantic, useless struggle, his arm a rigid bar of muscle. The other soldier kept his rifle leveled, covering Herr Hess and the whimpering Frau Schmidt. "Easy, lady, easy," the corporal said, his voice a low, rough rumble. The words meant nothing to Helga, but the tone was not aggressive. It was confused. He pulled her back, forcing her to turn and face him. Helga stared up into the face of the enemy. It was not the leering, demonic caricature from the Sturmer posters. It was a young face, shockingly young, perhaps 20. It was streaked with black grime and stubbled with a multi-day beard, but the eyes, shadowed beneath the heavy rim of his helmet, were not filled with hatred or bloodlust. They were just tired, infinitely tired. She stopped fighting. She just stared, panting, her hands frozen in front of her, still caked with blood and mortar dust. "My child," she gasped, pointing weakly at the pile. "Mein kind, bitte, please." The corporal's eyes followed her gesture. He looked at the mountain of rubble, his gaze analytical, professional. Then he looked back at her. He saw the raw, bleeding fingers. He saw the terror in her eyes, a terror that transcended language. It was not the fear of an enemy. It was the fear of a mother. His grip on her shoulder loosened slightly. "What's she saying, Corporal?" the first soldier asked, his rifle still steady. "Shut up, Riggs," the corporal muttered. He was listening. The cellar, for a moment, was utterly still. Even Lothar's cries had subsided to a terrified hiccup, and in that profound, pressurized silence, the corporal heard it. A tiny, scratching sound, a weak, suffocating cry from beneath the tons of brick. The corporal's entire posture changed. The tension did not leave him, but it shifted. He was no longer a conqueror clearing a bunker. He was something else. He looked at Helga one more time, his eyes locking onto hers. He saw no threat. He saw only a human being at the very edge of her sanity. He let go of her shoulder. Helga nearly collapsed, her legs buckling. He put up one hand, palm out, in a universal gesture. "Wait! Stop!" He turned his back on her, a gesture of trust so profound it momentarily stopped Helga's breath, and faced the rubble. He studied it for a second, estimating the weight, the keystones. Then he turned to his partner. "Riggs," he said, his voice sharp, all exhaustion gone. "Get on the horn. Tell Sergeant we need 2 more men down here now, shovels and a pry bar. We got a kid buried." Riggs, the first soldier, spoke urgently into a handheld radio, the strange, static-laced English cutting through the cellar's gloom. Helga paid him no mind. Her brief paralysis had broken. The corporal had turned his back. It was her chance. She threw herself at the pile again, her bloody fingers searching for purchase on a jagged piece of concrete. The corporal turned back, sighing, a sound of profound exhaustion. He grabbed her again, not by the shoulder, but by both wrists. "No," he said, and this time his voice was firm. "Out! Weg!" He hauled her to her feet and half-dragged, half-pushed her backward, depositing her next to Frau Schmidt and Lothar. "Stay," he commanded, pointing a definitive finger at the floor. Helga collapsed into a sitting position, every instinct screaming at her to fight him, to get back to the pile. But she was utterly spent, and she saw, with a clarity that cut through her panic, that her scratching was useless. The beams were too heavy, the bricks too tightly packed. Just then, 2 more soldiers scrambled down into the cellar, carrying shovels and a long iron pry bar. They were panting, their faces grim. "Here, Corporal," one asked. "Right here." The corporal pointed to the spot Helga had been clawing at. "Kid's under, alive. Easy does it." They began to work. Helga watched, her body vibrating with a terrible, helpless tension. They were not frantic, like her. They were methodical. They were fast. The corporal directed them, his voice low. "Pry bar under that beam. Easy. Lift on 3, 1, 2, 3. A large section of the ceiling joist, which Helga could not have budged an inch, was lifted and tossed aside. The other soldiers shoveled the smaller debris, working in a steady, powerful rhythm. They were a machine. The same terrible, efficient machine that had flattened her city. And they were using that efficiency to save her son. The contradiction was too much to bear. Her mind, steeped in years of propaganda, the grinning apes, the Jewish barbarians, could not process the scene. These hands, which she had been told would plunder and kill, were now carefully, almost gently, moving the stones that trapped her child. She fumbled in her pocket, her fingers closing around the hard, familiar shape of the porcelain bird. She pulled it out, needing to touch something real, something from the world before. As she stared at it, a wave of vertigo and nausea swept over her. Her grip loosened. The tiny chipped figurine slipped from her trembling fingers and fell, landing silently in the dust near her feet. She let it go. She was too weak to even bend and retrieve it. One of the soldiers, Riggs, paused to wipe the sweat and grime from his face. He glanced down, saw the small object. He nudged it with his boot, then crouched, picking it up. He looked at it for a second. A tiny, absurd piece of fragile civilization in this hellscape. He looked at Helga. He walked the 3 steps to her, his movements economical, and extended his gloved hand. He dropped the porcelain bird into her lap. He said nothing. He did not smile. He simply turned and went back to digging. Helga stared at the bird, now resting in her palm. A single hot tear traced a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. "Got him!" the corporal suddenly yelled. "I see a hand. Kid, we got you." They redoubled their efforts, moving faster now, tossing bricks aside. A space opened up. The corporal, flat on his stomach, reached deep into the hole. He's pinned by the leg, but he's loose. I'm pulling him gently. A moment later, he slid backward, dragging Carl with him. The boy was limp, covered in white plaster dust, looking like a small, terrified ghost. He was breathing, his eyes wide with shock, but he was, impossibly, alive. Carl was coughing, a thin, dusty rattle, but he was breathing. The corporal set him on his wobbly legs and patted his back, a gesture that was firm, almost rough, yet undeniably reassuring. "He's okay, Mutter, just scared." Helga scrambled forward, ignoring her raw fingers, and pulled Carl against her. She buried her face in his hair, which smelled of plaster and the grave. She looked up at the corporal, her mouth open, but no words came out. Danka seemed too small, too absurd. The corporal did not wait for thanks. The rescue was complete. The mission had resumed. "Riggs, get 'em ready," he ordered, his voice all business again. "We're moving these civilians to the CCP. This block ain't clear." "What about—" Riggs gestured with his chin toward the body of the SS soldier near the entrance. "Leave him. We move, now." The corporal turned back to Helga. He pointed to her, then to Lothar, who was now clinging silently to Frau Schmidt, and then to the wrecked cellar door. "Out. Raus. We go." Helga nodded, her limbs feeling like water. She tried to lift Carl, but her arms, which had just clawed through brick, now had no strength. She scooped up Lothar from Frau Schmidt instead, settling his meager weight on her hip. "Carl," she whispered, "hold my coat. We must walk." Carl took 2 steps, his face pale, and then his ankle, which had been pinned, buckled. He let out a small cry and stumbled. Helga was trapped. She could not carry both. She could not leave one. She looked wildly at Herr Hess, who was staring blankly at the wall, and at Frau Schmidt, who was struggling to her own feet. The corporal let out an impatient sigh. "Jesus, give him here!" Before Helga could protest, he leaned down and scooped Carl up with one arm, settling the boy against his chest. Carl, too stunned to fight, just clung to the soldier's ammunition belt, his small fingers gripping the canvas. The corporal now held his rifle in one hand and her son in the other. Riggs stepped forward, looking at the wide-eyed Lothar. "Might as well make it a match set, Corp." He held his arms out to Helga. "Come on, lady. He's safer with me. Kind." Helga flinched. To willingly hand over her other child? "It's okay, Mutter," the corporal said, his voice softer this time, sensing her hesitation. We're getting you out of the line of fire. Sicher, safe." Numbly, her body moving on autopilot, Helga transferred Lothar's weight. The soldier, Riggs, balanced the boy on his hip as if he were carrying a sack of rations. "All right," the corporal commanded. "We go. Me and the kid, front. Civilians in the middle. Riggs, you and the other one take the rear. Stay low. Move fast." He led the way up the broken steps and into the daylight. Helga stumbled out after him, emerging from the tomb into the world. The light was blinding, a harsh, flat gray that made her eyes water. The air was frigid and thick with the smell of burning, not wood smoke, but the acrid chemical stink of burning insulation, rubber, and death. The street was unrecognizable. It was not a street. It was a canyon of pulverized buildings. A Sherman tank sat stalled 20 yards away, its tread broken, its cannon aimed at a sky Helga could no longer see. The corporal moved quickly, crouching low, his rifle scanning the high windows of the opposite ruins. He was all business again, but he was also carrying her son. Helga stared at his back. She watched the impossible image, a broad American soldier, armed to the teeth, carefully carrying her German son past the wreckage of their lives. She saw Riggs behind her, doing the same with Lothar. The propaganda had lied. The posters were wrong. The radio was wrong. Herr Hess was wrong. Her entire world, the one built on absolute certainty of who the enemy was, fractured and collapsed, just like the cellar wall. As they rounded the corner, moving toward the relative safety of the next block, she saw another group. Another soldier, his face just as grim, was carrying an elderly German woman piggyback. Another was handing a C-ration cracker to a small girl. Her knees felt weak, and for the first time, it was not from fear. The safe zone was the shell of St. Peter's Church. Its roof was gone. A skeleton of charred beams opened to the gray, indifferent sky. The stained glass windows were jagged holes, rattling with every gust of wind. But the stone walls, thick and defiant, were still standing. The corporal led them through the fractured archway of the main entrance. The inside was crowded. Dozens of people, figures Helga recognized from the neighborhood, and many she did not, were huddled on the stone floor. They were overwhelmingly women, children, and old men, their faces uniformly gray with dust and shock. An almost religious silence hung in the air, broken only by a child's cough or a low moan. When the soldiers entered, a ripple of fear passed through the crowd. Every eye fixed on the uniforms, the rifles. This was the moment they had all been dreading. This was captivity. Helga felt the collective tension, the shared, unspoken question. What happens now? Riggs gently lowered Lothar to the ground. The boy, sensing Helga, immediately scrambled to her legs and clung to her coat, hiding his face. The corporal crouched and set Karl down beside his brother. Karl's ankle was already swelling, but he was standing. The transaction was complete. The soldiers had delivered the civilians. They could leave. They should leave, go back to their war. But the corporal did not leave. He remained crouched for a moment, looking at Karl. His gaze was no longer that of a soldier. It was something else, something weary and human. He sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the bottom of his boots, and reached into one of the large canvas pockets on his fatigues. Helga tensed. She pulled Lothar closer. The soldier's hand emerged, not with a weapon, not with papers, but with a small, dark brown bar wrapped in paper and foil. He tore the wrapper open. He snapped the bar in half with a crisp, definitive crack. He held out one half to Karl. Karl stared at it. Chocolate. He had not seen real chocolate in 3 years. He looked up at Helga, his eyes wide, asking permission. Is it safe? Can I? Helga's mind flashed with the final propaganda directives. Do not take their food. It is poisoned. It is a trick. She looked at the chocolate, then at the man offering it, the man who had pulled her son from the rubble, the man whose gloved hand had returned her porcelain bird. She gave a small, jerky nod. Carl's small, dirty hand reached out and took the chocolate. He held it as if it were a holy relic. The corporal, his duty done, pushed himself to his feet. Helga watched him, but she also saw the rest of the church. Every mother in the room had been watching. They had seen the rescue. They had seen the hesitation. And now, they had seen this small, pointless, profound act of grace. A woman near the ruined altar, a woman Helga did not know, covered her mouth with her hand. Her shoulders began to shake. A sound escaped her. Not a scream, but a low, tearing sob. It was a signal. Another woman, near the baptismal font, began to weep, her head bowed. Then another, and another. A wave of quiet, shattering grief rolled through the church. It was not the sound of terror. It was the sound of a tension that had been held for months, for years, finally breaking. It was the sound of utter exhaustion, of impossible relief, of a reality so different from the one they had been prepared for that it broke them. Helga felt a strange hot pressure in her own throat. She felt the wetness on her own cheeks. She looked down at her hand, still clenched. She opened it. The porcelain bird, chipped and dirty, lay in her palm. She was crying. She had not cried when the cellar collapsed. She had not cried when Carl was buried. But she cried now, silently, as the American soldiers turned and walked back out into the war, leaving her sons and the scent of chocolate behind. The church was quiet again, but it was a different silence. The oppressive, terrified hush had been broken, replaced by the soft, exhausted sounds of weeping. The women cried openly now, holding each other, their faces streaked with grime and tears. They were not weeping for what they had lost, but perhaps, Helga thought, for what they had just been given. A moment of impossible kindness that proved they were not entirely forsaken. The cold air felt sharp in her lungs. The war was still raging just beyond these stone walls. She could hear the distant, rhythmic thump of mortars. Nothing had ended, and yet, for her, everything had changed. Her gaze fell on her sons. Lothar was still pressed against her leg, but his face was turned upward. Carl stood very still, holding the half-bar of Hershey's chocolate. He looked at it, then at Helga. He seemed to understand its significance. He lifted it to his nose, inhaling the scent, a rich, sweet aroma of a world they had all but forgotten. Then, very carefully, he broke off a small piece and held it out to Lothar. Lothar, his eyes wide, took the piece and immediately put it in his mouth. A look of slow, profound disbelief spread across his small, dirty face. Carl took a piece for himself. He did not devour it. He ate it slowly, one small bite, letting it melt on his tongue. Helga watched them. She looked at Carl, saved by the enemy. She looked at Lothar, fed by the enemy. She looked at Herr Hess, who was now sitting alone, tearing the edges of his Nazi propaganda newspaper into small, meaningless strips. He was a relic, a ghost from a world that had just died in a cellar. What would she teach them now? The question hung in the cold, sacred air. How could she ever explain the posters on their school walls? How could she explain the radio broadcasts that had promised monsters when the men who came had pulled her son from a grave? The shame was a physical weight, heavier than the rubble. They had been lied to. They had believed the lies, fueled them, allowed them to fester until they rotted the nation from the inside out, ending in a cellar with a dead SS boy who had died for that lie. The Americans were not saviors. She knew that. They were conquerors. This was occupation. The future was a terrifying gray unknown. They were now at the mercy of the men whose chocolate her son was eating. The complexity of it was dizzying. But in that singular moment, it did not matter. Politics, nations, flags, they were abstractions. The corporal who dug for her son was real. The soldier who returned her trinket was real. The chocolate was real. Her hand, which had been clenched so tightly, relaxed. She opened her palm and looked at the object that had pressed its shape into her skin. The porcelain bird. It was covered in dust, its blue painted wings dull, the chip on its right side a familiar tiny wound. It had been Carl's favorite, a useless, fragile thing. It should have been shattered a dozen times today, in the collapse, in her pocket, in the fall to the floor. But it had survived. She would keep it. She would keep it for the rest of her life. It would not be a reminder of Aachen, or the cellar, or the terror. It would be a different kind of relic, a testament. Proof that even in the suffocating dust of hatred, in the heart of the enemy, humanity was not a rumor. It was a choice. She closed her fingers around it, the smooth, cold porcelain a sudden, solid anchor. She took a deep breath, tasting only the cold, and pulled both of her sons into her arms.